2 submarines, both German, both armed, both at sea, long after Germany had surrendered, not by hours, not by days, by months. When U-530 surfaced off the coast of Argentina on July 10, 1945, the war in Europe had been over for 63 days. When U-977 pulled into Mar del Plata on August 17th, it had been over for 101 days. Their crews had been submerged, cut off, operating on last known orders, moving through an ocean that had technically stopped being a battlefield while they were still inside it. In Europe, soldiers were being demobilized. Prisoner of war camps were processing hundreds of thousands of German captives. The newspapers were running photographs of liberated concentration camps and devastated cities. The world was changing at a speed that made it almost impossible to track, even for people who were above the surface and had access to radio and print and other human faces. The crews of these 2 submarines had none of that. They had their captain, their instruments, their closed and recycled air, and whatever he told them. The men who went down were sailors in wartime. The men who came up were survivors in a world that had already moved on without them. This is the story of what actually happened during those months beneath the South Atlantic. Not the conspiracy theories, not the legends about who might have been aboard. The human story. 2 young commanders in their 20s, making impossible decisions, in steel tubes full of men who just wanted to go home. To understand why these men did what they did, you have to understand what it meant to be a U-boat crewman in the spring of 1945. The submarine service had once been the most prestigious posting in the German Navy. In the early years of the war, U-boats were the hunters. Between 1940 and 1942, they tore through Allied merchant shipping at a rate that nearly strangled Britain. Grand Admiral Dönitz called this period the happy time. His commanders came back to port with tonnage tallies and press coverage. The submarine arm was where ambitious young German sailors went to make their names. By 1945, it had become something else entirely. A submarine patrol lasted anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. You lived in a metal tube roughly 60 meters long, crammed with machinery, torpedoes, stores, and up to 50 men. Privacy didn't exist. There was one toilet for the entire crew. When the boat left port fully provisioned, food hung from every available hook in the forward compartment. Sausages, bread, canned goods suspended from the overhead, and you ate your way down to the actual bunks over the first 2 weeks. You slept in a bunk still warm from whoever just came off watch. You surfaced when ordered. You dived when the alarm sounded. And the alarm could sound at any moment, any hour of the day or night. That was the life. That was what they signed up for. What had changed dramatically by the spring of 1945 was the math of coming back alive. Allied forces had broken key elements of German naval communication codes. Long-range Liberator bombers now covered vast stretches of the Atlantic that had previously been beyond their reach. New centimeter-wave radar let surface escorts and aircraft locate submarines that thought they were running safely in the dark. The acoustic homing torpedo could chase a diving submarine without needing a direct hit. The hunters had been out-hunted, and by this point, everyone knew it. British propaganda had recently estimated the average operational life of a U-boat at 40 days. Schaefer, in his post-war memoir, notes that German crews looked at that number and thought, yes, that sounds about right. They'd done the math themselves, quietly, over months of watching classmates from their training groups get posted to boats that never came back. Out of 40,000 men who served, in the German submarine fleet across the entire war, roughly 30,000 did not come home. 3 out of 4. Let that settle for a moment. On a crew of 50 men, that's 37 or 38 who statistically would die before the war ended. These weren't abstract numbers. These were names. Men you'd trained with, men you'd shared bunks with, Men whose letters you'd read aloud in the control room when mail arrived. By 1945, volunteering for the submarine service was an ambition. For many of the men going out on late war patrols, it was simply the only available direction. You didn't choose the U-boats so much as the U-boats were what was left. And the men who went out that spring, young men, most of them, some, on their first real commands, went out knowing the odds. U-530 was a Type 9C/40 submarine, a long-range boat, built for exactly the kind of extended operations far from European waters that the Atlantic demanded. She'd been in service since October 1942, had completed 6 patrols under her previous commander, and by early 1945 had a competent, experienced crew underneath a commander who had barely been in charge long enough to know them. That commander was Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth, 24 years old. January of 1945 was the first time he'd ever had his own boat. U-530 was his first real combat patrol. He'd left Horten in southern Norway on March 3, 1945, with orders to operate off Halifax and New York, the North American coast, enemy waters, but waters where a long-range submarine could theoretically operate for weeks without being found, hunting convoys in the shipping lanes off Long Island. He was, to be direct about it, young and inexperienced for the scale of decisions he was about to face. U-977 was a Type 5 IIC, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, smaller than U-530, shorter range, a boat built for the North Atlantic, not extended distant operations. Her commander was Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer, 23 years old. He'd served as a watch officer on other boats before the war turned, had survived a patrol where roughly half the crew caught diphtheria, had been pulled off that boat for command school. The boat he left never came back from its next mission. He was given U-977 in April 1945. His orders were to enter the port of Southampton on the southern coast of England and attack any shipping he found there. One Type 6C submarine, one of the busiest, most heavily defended ports in Britain. In the spring of 1945, when Allied anti-submarine capability was at its wartime peak. Some historians have described this assignment as near suicidal. Schaefer, writing years later, describes it with a certain dark clarity. He understood what it was. He went anyway, because those were his orders, and there was a war on. U-977 left Kristiansand, Norway, on May 2nd, 1945. She was still running north of Scotland on her way to England when Germany surrendered 6 days later. May 4th, 1945. Grand Admiral Dönitz broadcast a ceasefire order to all U-boats at sea. Cease all hostilities immediately. Stop all hostile action against Allied shipping. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Both submarines were submerged when these signals went out. Communication with submarines was never clean or reliable even under normal conditions. A boat running on its snorkel, the breathing tube that let diesel engines operate at periscope depth while the hull stayed submerged, was particularly difficult to reach. Radio reception depended on depth, sea state, antenna position, atmospheric conditions. Signals didn't always come through whole. Sometimes they came through as noise. Schaefer received something from headquarters, while U-977 was threading through waters north of Scotland. In his memoir, he describes a signal coming in while they were snorkeling, a message that told all men of the submarine service they had fought bravely, had accomplished extraordinary things, and that the order now was to stand down and take instructions from the Allied command. He thought it was a fake. This was not paranoia. Allied deception operations had been running against German submarines for years. A radio message in German saying, "The war is over, please surface and surrender," was exactly what you'd transmit if you wanted to sink a U-boat without spending depth charges. The suspicious thing wasn't that Schaefer doubted the signal. The suspicious thing, from a certain angle, would have been if he hadn't. More signals followed in the next days. Allied broadcasts in German, ordering submarines to surface, hoist white or blue flags, proceed to designated ports. Multiple broadcasts, clear and repeated. Schaefer listened to all of them. He turned the situation over in his mind, and then he gathered his crew in the control room. What he told them in his own account: the war was lost. Germany had surrendered. They had three choices: surface and surrender to the Allies at the nearest port, scuttle the boat, or sail to a country that had treated Germany with relative respect throughout the war, a country like Argentina, which had only recently and under significant Allied pressure declared war on Germany at all. He laid it out. He said he would propose the third option, but he made clear it was their decision. The vote: 30 men chose Argentina, 2 chose Spain, 16, the married men, the petty officers, the older crew members, wanted to go home to their families. Schaefer honored it. He put the 16 men who wanted to go home ashore from rubber dinghies near the island of Holsney, off the Norwegian coast, on May 10th. They were in British hands within days. They survived. They went home eventually after prisoner of war processing. Then U-977 turned south, 30 men on a combat submarine sailing for the South Atlantic, knowing the war they'd been fighting was over. What happened next is one of the most remarkable underwater passages in submarine history. From May 10th to July 14th, 1945, 66 days, U-977 made what Schaefer described as a continuous snorkel passage from the waters north of Scotland toward the west coast of Africa. Not surfacing, not seeing daylight, running submerged on snorkel depth, burning through provisions, breathing recycled air, listening to the ocean through the hydrophones, and waiting. According to Schaefer, this was the second longest continuous submerged voyage of the entire war, behind only U-978's 68 days. The summary from U-boat.net, drawing on Schaefer's account and post-war naval records, states plainly, the journey was extremely stressful for the crew, and many were, apparently, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Think about what that means. These weren't men under fire, no depth charges, no destroyer screws overhead, no alarms, nothing but weeks of steel walls, diesel fumes, the hum of the electric motors, and the slow accumulation of time in a sealed space. The men had voted to go to Argentina. They were going to Argentina. But in 66 days of submergence, with nothing to do but think, the question of what Argentina actually meant, what any of it meant now that the thing they'd organized their lives around was over, must have been a constant and exhausting companion. The physical conditions were brutal even before the psychological weight was added. A Type 8 submarine running, submerged for extended periods, built up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, faster than the scrubbers could fully handle. The air went stale. Concentration got harder. Men felt slow and heavy in ways they couldn't quite name. Food ran down from the provisions they'd started with, and there was no resupply coming. Every meal was a subtraction from a fixed total. The boat stank. Diesel, sweat, condensation running down the curved walls, the particular smell of recycled air that every submariner knew but couldn't describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. And the darkness. Running submerged meant no natural light for weeks. The fluorescent lighting gave men's faces a greenish cast, made everyone look sick, made it impossible to know what time it was without checking the clock. And underneath all of that, the question nobody could fully answer. What are we going to? They knew Argentina was a country with a name on a map. They knew roughly where it was. They knew it had not been at war with Germany for most of the conflict. Beyond that, very little. None of them spoke Spanish. None of them had any contacts there. Schaefer's reasoning was essentially, Argentina recently declared war on Germany only under Allied pressure and late in the war, so maybe they'll treat us better than the British would. That was the entire plan. Go there and hope. 66 days of holding that thought in a submerged metal tube with 30 other men. The American Naval Interrogation Report filed in September of that year, based on crew interviews after U-977's arrival, doesn't entirely match Schaefer's memoir. It doesn't describe a continuous 66-day submerged passage. It says the boat was detected by Allied direction-finding equipment multiple times in late May, that it dived once on sighting a plane and once on sighting a ship. Historians have generally treated Schaefer's account as more reliable, noting that the American report was compiled through translators from crew members who had reason to be cautious about everything they said. The truth is probably somewhere between the two accounts. What nobody disputes: the men spent most of those weeks underwater, and it did real psychological damage. The boat stopped briefly at the Cape Verde Islands, a short swim break, Schaefer called it, then continued south, running on one diesel to conserve fuel. Crossing the equator on July 23rd, the southern hemisphere, waters most of this crew had never been in, on a boat designed for the North Atlantic, crewed by 30 men who spoke no Spanish and had no particular plan beyond arriving. U-977 pulled into Mar del Plata, Argentina, on August 17, 1945. 108 days after leaving Norway. 101 days after Germany surrendered. Otto Wehrmuth on U-530 had been trying to fight right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. His orders sent him to hunt off Halifax, then New York. Finding little in Canadian waters, he turned south to Long Island. In the days between May 4th and May 7th, 1945, with Germany's government in its final collapse, with the ceasefire order already broadcast, U-530 fired 9 torpedoes at Allied convoys in waters off New York. 3 separate attacks, 9 torpedoes. Every single one either missed or malfunctioned. One had a battery explosion in the tube before it left the boat. He was still firing at Allied shipping one day before Germany's formal surrender. When Wehrmuth then learned of the German capitulation, he made his decision. He told interrogators he believed the surrender order might be an Allied trick, and that even if it wasn't, even if Germany had genuinely, officially, irrevocably surrendered, his crew would fare better in Argentina than in Allied prisoner of war custody. Given what Goebbels' propaganda had been broadcasting about Allied intentions for post-war Germany, this fear was real. Whether it was rational is harder to judge from 60 years' distance. He ordered all classified materials destroyed. The logbook went overboard. Secret equipment went overboard. Remaining torpedoes, 5 of them, went overboard. And then, something that has puzzled historians ever since. The deck gun went overboard too. The problem is that U-530 was a Type 9C/40, and that class of submarine had its deck guns removed back in 1943, 2 years before this patrol. So, what gun was thrown overboard? Where did it come from? Wehrmuth gave no satisfactory answer. The crew gave no satisfactory answer. That detail has fed conspiracy theories ever since, and the honest answer is that it has never been resolved. The boat arrived at Mar del Plata on July 10th, 1945, 130 days after leaving Norway, 63 days after Germany surrendered. Investigators who got aboard found a vessel in notable condition. Eyewitnesses described rust, fire traces on the exterior, and damage to the conning tower. All documentation was gone. Every crew member's identification papers were gone. The rubber dinghy was missing and couldn't be explained. The armament was gone. And Wehrmuth, 24 years old, sat in front of Argentine naval officers and then American interrogators and gave them essentially nothing. The crew, separately interviewed, gave somewhat more. But the picture that emerged was not a picture of hidden passengers or clandestine missions. It was a picture of a young commander who had made a series of calls under extreme uncertainty, who understood that the more he explained, the more questions he'd create, and who had decided silence was safer than specifics. Neither crew had much time to rest before the interrogations began in earnest. The Brazilian cruiser Bahia had been sunk on July 4, 1945, after Germany surrendered, while both submarines were still at sea. A Brazilian admiral initially suspected U-530 or U-977. The charge was serious. Attacking an Allied vessel after the war was formally over would be a war crime. Full stop. Argentine naval investigators looked into it. American intelligence investigated. The Argentine Ministry of the Navy issued a formal communique. Neither submarine had sunk the Bahia, and U-530 had landed no one on the Argentine coast before surrendering. A subsequent investigation established that the Bahia had been sunk by a gunnery accident during her own cruise drills. The accusation was dropped. The larger accusations were much harder to dismiss because they were harder to disprove. Had these submarines transported escaping Nazi leaders to Argentina? Had they carried Hitler, Nazi gold, documents to fund a post-war underground movement from South American exile? The conspiracy theories spread fast. The timing looked suspicious even to neutral observers. Argentina's government had spent most of the war sympathetic to Germany. 2 submarines arriving months late, with destroyed logbooks, with crews who wouldn't talk. From a certain angle, that looked exactly like what a clandestine extraction operation would look like. The narrative wrote itself without any actual evidence. Schaefer was specific in his interrogation about his reasoning. He cited the Goebbels propaganda broadcast about the Morgenthau Plan, the Allied proposal which had circulated in various forms to essentially deindustrialize Germany and reduce it to a pastoral state. In Goebbels' telling, all German men would be enslaved and sterilized. Schaefer was 23 years old when he heard that broadcast, in a world where propaganda had been the background noise of his entire adult life. He believed it, or believed it enough to make it part of his calculation. That's documented in his interrogation, not in his memoir. He said it immediately upon capture, not years later. He was wrong about the plan being implemented in that form. But the fear was genuine, and it explains the choice in human terms, without requiring any conspiracy. American investigators concluded that neither submarine had carried any passengers beyond their listed crews. The Bohr conspiracy theories did not conclude anything. They continue today. 64 U-boats were at sea when the ceasefire order went out on May 4th. The great majority complied. They surfaced. They raised their flags. They transmitted positions. They navigated to designated Allied surrender ports. Loch Erebor in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, ports in England, ports in Canada. Crews were processed as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. The boats were impounded. The men were, by the standards of the war they'd just emerged from, treated reasonably. Most were home within 2 years. The surrender process in Scotland has been documented extensively. Photographs from Loch Erebor show rows of German submarines rafted together in the cold northern anchorage, flying black flags as ordered, their crews standing on the casings in their leather jackets and white peaked caps. They look tired in the photographs. They look like men who have been at sea for a long time and would like to stop. The war they'd been fighting had promised them things it didn't deliver. They went to the anchorage anyway, because the orders said to go and because there was nothing else left to do. 156 German submarines surrendered to Allied forces in the weeks after May 8th. In European waters, the process was orderly. Boats came in, crews came off, files were opened and reviewed. The boats that surrendered intact were later dealt with collectively. Under Operation Deadlight, run from November 1945 through February 1946, 116 surrendered U-boats were towed out to waters west of Scotland and Ireland and sunk, some by gunfire, some by torpedo, some simply by opening the seacocks and letting the Atlantic do what the Atlantic does. The weather was bad for much of the operation. Some boats sank before they could be towed to the designated area. Several Royal Navy and Allied vessels were damaged during towing in rough seas. It was unglamorous, undignified work, disposing of what had once been the most feared submarine force in the world. The wrecks are there now, scattered across the seabed in those grey northern waters, and the ocean gives no indication of their presence. Not every boat that was at sea received clean orders. U-853 was operating off the American East Coast and apparently did not receive a clear ceasefire signal before she attacked and sank the American collier Black Point on May 5th, one day after the ceasefire order, 4 days before Germany's formal surrender. Black Point went down off Point Judith, Rhode Island. 12 of her crew were killed. American forces hunted U-853 down within hours near Block Island, Rhode Island. All 55 men aboard the submarine were killed. Whether they knew the war was effectively over when they made that attack, the record cannot say with certainty. What the record does say is that they didn't surface, and they died for it in shallow water off an island their families had probably never heard of. This is the spectrum against which Wormuth and Schaefer have to be understood. Some men got clear orders and followed them and came home. Some men got unclear orders and made different decisions and came home later to more questions. Some men, apparently, got nothing and didn't come home at all. 30,000. That's how many German submariners died in the Second World War. Out of 40,000 who served. 3 out of 4. These are the numbers you have to hold in your head when you look at the 2 boats that went to Argentina. Because the striking thing, the thing that doesn't make the headlines, is that their crews survived. All of them. Schaefer's 30 men and Wormuth's crew. They argued with their captors and stonewalled their interrogators and spent 2 years being moved between Argentine and American and British custody, and they came home. By the statistical standards of the U-boat service, that makes them extraordinary. Not because of the mystery around their voyages, because they were still alive when it was over. The men who kept fighting to the last day, the crew of U-853, still firing off Rhode Island on May 5th, are at the bottom of Block Island Sound. The men who surfaced immediately and surrendered in May of 1945 went home in 1947, or sometimes later, depending on how long processing took. The men who went to Argentina went home in 1947 too, more or less. Same timeline, different route, same result. Think about what 3 out of 4 means for the men who survived. You entered the service with classmates. You trained with them, ate with them, learned the boats with them. You know how many of those men never came back. You know specific boats, specific patrols, specific dates when the letters stopped coming. You carry that. Every man who made it to 1945 carried it. Schaefer had been pulled off his previous boat for medical reasons. That boat never returned. He knew, very precisely, what he'd been spared. His decision to go to Argentina rather than risk Allied captivity was the decision of a man who'd already used up his allocation of luck once and wasn't sure he had any left. The conspiracy theories about Hitler escaping to Argentina have been thoroughly investigated and thoroughly debunked. Soviet forces recovered Hitler's dental remains in Berlin in May of 1945. His identity has been confirmed by forensic examination multiple times. The records are extensive. The conclusion is not contested by serious historians. What actually happened is simpler and stranger than any of the stories. 2 young men, in their first commands, made decisions under conditions of profound uncertainty. They chose Argentina because they were afraid. One of them explicitly said so in his interrogation before he'd had time to construct a more flattering narrative. They spent months at sea in the aftermath of a war that had been organized around the idea of Germany winning. They arrived in a foreign country they'd never seen, whose language none of them spoke, and they tried to explain themselves to people who were very interested in the wrong questions. The logbooks are gone. The gaps in the record stay gaps. But the human shape of the story is actually quite legible if you look at it straight. 2 young commanders doing their best with bad information in circumstances that had no good options. Consider what Schaefer knew about his own recent history when he made his decision. His previous boat, the one he'd been pulled off due to illness, had sailed without him and never returned. Every man on that crew was dead. He'd been given U-977 in April, sent on a near-suicidal mission in May, and then informed by radio that the mission no longer existed because the war no longer existed. He was 23 years old with no war to fight and an Allied prisoner of war system waiting for him, operated by the same people whose intentions toward Germany had been described to him in the most catastrophic terms possible. The propaganda was wrong, as it turned out, but he couldn't have known that. He had nothing reliable to distinguish the truth from the lies except his own judgment, in a steel tube, with 30 men looking at him. The submarine service that sent them out had already spent 6 years consuming its own people at an unsustainable rate. By the spring of 1945, it was burning through its last remaining experienced men, sending young officers on their first commands into waters where nothing was survivable, against enemies who had solved every problem the U-boats could pose. Schaefer and Wehrmuth looked at that, and looked at the conflicting signals they were receiving, and made the calculation that seems obvious in retrospect. Staying alive was the only option that left any options open. 3 out of 4 of their fellow submariners didn't have the chance to make that calculation. U-530 is still down there, 850 feet of water, 40 nautical miles northeast of Provincetown, Massachusetts. The Atlantic, at that depth, is cold enough to slow deterioration significantly. Naval researcher Eric Weiberg documented, in research published in the 2010s, that to his knowledge, the wreck had never been located or documented by any dive team. The depth makes it unreachable by recreational divers. The last photographs anyone took of U-530 were shot in November of 1947, after the torpedo from USS Toro hit her. The boat listing, the bow going under, then the ocean closing over her. Whatever is still aboard, gear the crew didn't think to destroy, personal effects, anything that survived the crossing from Norway to New York to Argentina, and the crossing back, is there in the dark. Cold water preserves things. Metal, fabric, occasionally paper, if the seal holds. The logbook isn't there. That went over the side somewhere in the South Atlantic, in the weeks after May 8th, 1945. Whatever Otto Wehrmuth recorded about the patrol, the routes, the decisions, the thinking, is gone. He kept his silence for the rest of his life and took whatever he knew with him when he died. Heinz Schaefer put it all in the memoir, spent decades answering for it, died in 1979, still saying he hadn't carried anyone he shouldn't have. His granddaughter wrote a foreword to the latest edition. The 16 married men he put ashore in Norway in May of 1945. The ones who chose their families over Argentina. They made it home too. British custody, then release, then home. A different route to the same place. Both choices worked out. 3 out of 4 of their fellow submariners didn't get to choose anything at all.